When I was studying in Munich, I went into town every day by train. I passed by a row of houses, and on top there was a graffiti saying, "Luisa, I love you." I thought, how much in love must he have been to do such a dangerous thing? Beloved do crazy things. Love is looking for all sorts of ways to show to the other that he or she is loved. And this is the same for God. And that's what we want to celebrate in these days. Normally, all of us would have wanted to be in Altötting to celebrate Easter party together. This year is different. A lot is different in these days. And this is why we are spending the Easter time in places where we usually are, in our family homes, on campus, wherever. And probably you're sitting at your desk in front of the computer. Nevertheless, I think we can learn something very special. God is not only present in holy places, places of pilgrimage or in churches, but God is getting close. He's a God of mankind. He wants to be close to people. Where we are, also God is present. He's the Emmanuel, the God with us. So we can also be connected amongst each other and celebrate these Easter days together in another way as usual. The feast that we are celebrating today has its root in a Jewish feast, the Passover, which also wasn't celebrated in the temple, but in the family homes, in the households. There were some rules for this feast, and one rule was that it should be celebrated within the city walls of Jerusalem. So Jesus stuck to the rules and celebrated this feast within the city walls together with his new family, his disciples. Nowadays, we often hear, wash your hands regularly, frequently, thoroughly. In those days, it was also important to wash your feet. All day you were walking in sandals on dusty streets, so your feet were really dirty in the end of the day. That's why there was the custom that before you sit at table, a slave would wash your feet. On this special day today, Jesus himself washed the feet of his disciples. Not just because they were lacking a slave, but because he wanted to show them something about himself, of his being, of who he really is. So he descends, he bends down to the disciples, and that he prepares us to sit at his table and to be able to live community. It's also becoming clear that there are no preconditions for God. We don't have to do great deeds, but he takes us as we are. He doesn't set any limits. It's us who's setting limits to God, as did Peter when he said in today's gospel, "No, I'm not worthy." That's a false humility that doesn't allow to accept God's help to let yourself be cleansed by God. Today, we won't be able to do the washing of the feet as usual, but when the priest will put down the bowl and the jar in front of the altar, we can get aware that Jesus is also bending down to us, that he wants to come into areas of my life that I esteem as unworthy, dirty, maybe even embarrassing. He is bending down to me, and we can experience that Jesus wants us to touch in these areas, that he wants us to meet us there. And then he also gave an order to his disciples: do as I did, love one another as I have loved you. Maybe in our situation we don't have so many possibilities to help others. Maybe we are getting aware that we have limits within us that prevent us to be there for others. But I think it's important that we do something good wherever we have the chance to do so. And that's Jesus' invitation of today. I also think that we can't live the Eucharist when we don't try to live charity. Eucharist means giving thanks and also means sharing. Breaking the bread means sharing. We really should keep this in our minds. Today we are celebrating that Jesus gives himself in the Eucharist. And the special thing in today's liturgy is a tiny word, and that is today. This should help us to get aware that we don't just commemorate a day 2,000 years ago, but that Jesus gives himself for us today. He gives himself for you and for me. It's not over yet. It's not just a historic moment. His love is present today. He says, "This is my body, this is my blood for you." When he's saying body, he's speaking about himself with all his being. He is giving himself totally. God is not giving anything, but he is giving himself. And a veritable change is taking place. The substance is changing. Physically, it is still bread. It doesn't taste or feel differently. From the external, it hasn't changed. But the substance is really different. It stays bread, but it has deeply changed into something different, even if you can't see it. The Eucharist is much more real than all the other things with whom I'm dealing with every day. When we see that God, that Christ, is making himself so small to come into this bread, it can cause in us an enormous joy that God comes so close. Closer could not be possible. But it can also cause other thoughts or emotions. Can this be possible? It's quite strange. I can't believe it. And maybe I don't want God to be as close, so small. Maybe I'd preferred him to be far and to stay big. And despite of all our thoughts, Jesus is going to give himself to us today. Nobody forced him to do so. On the cross, his life was taken, but in the Eucharist, he gave himself. His death on the cross would, without the Eucharist, be a senseless massacre. And the Eucharist, the words during the Last Supper, would, without his death, be like a currency that's not covered. Only together they give sense to the dying of Jesus, and together they open up our view on the resurrection. Today we can't receive Holy Communion, but we can still communicate. We can have part in the community. When we ask Jesus, "Come to me, come and visit me," he will do everything to come to us in a different way, but in a very real way. We've already heard about the rules to stay within Jerusalem for Passover. Jerusalem was like the room of God, where God held his protecting hand over the people. Jesus, however, after supper, leaves the city together with his disciples. He crosses the brook of Kedron, the limit, and goes into a place of farness from God, of darkness, of horror, into the area of the evil and the area of sin. He goes onto the deepest ground of sin. in the Garden Gethsemane, where he will be left alone by the disciples and where he will be treated by a kiss. The prayer in Gethsemane helps us to understand 3 points. Jesus was afraid. He had a human anxiety, a fear of death, the primal fear of humankind. Secondly, more profoundly, he experienced the terror of evil on his own body and soul. And he absorbed this terror of evil, this farness from God, the sin. What must that have caused within Jesus? It's like light and darkness, life and death coming together. That must have been an enormous tension within him. It's hard to imagine. Thirdly, Jesus experienced the absence, the silence of his Father, far more than we can imagine, because Jesus had lived a greater closeness to him during all his life. Faith means for us that we follow Jesus when he goes to this place. We go with him knowing that he is the stronger one who has already conquered death. In his death he set himself against death. Today's day shows us that there is no place where God is absent, that there is no sin too big or too heavy to be forgiven. So we really can give everything to him, and he also wants us to accompany him. By the end of today's liturgy, we're going to have the opportunity to do so, to be with him, to keep watch with him. When we follow him into his loneliness, we can also hand over everything that's abandoned and lonely within us. We can let him enter there. Our sprayer in Munich, he knew that Luisa would take this train line. He also knew that he would like to visualize his love for her so that she could see it every day. But what was not in his hands was, would Luisa perceive this love message? Would she see it, or would she be occupied with other things like her mobile, with a book, whatever? The same for Jesus. He gave himself until the end, but it's not in his hands what we are going to do with what we are doing with it, how we are going to receive his dedication. It's up to us.